It was just a regular Saturday morning until I stumbled upon something that shattered my entire world. Tucked away in my wife's dresser was a stack of photos, pictures of her kissing a man I'd never seen before, outside a hotel. The shock hit me, but then I found the note, "You know what you need to do. Bring the money, or these go public." This wasn't just infidelity, it was blackmail. Now, I had a choice: let it destroy me or fight back. The morning started like any other Saturday. Claire had already left the house, mentioning something about errands and a quick coffee with her friend Laura. I was home alone, going through my usual weekend routine, sorting laundry, tidying up, and folding clothes in the quiet of our bedroom. The sunlight poured through the window, casting a soft glow on the bed where we'd shared countless moments of laughter, intimacy, and whispered dreams. But as I opened Claire's dresser, pulling out her folded tops to make space, I noticed something unusual. There, tucked deep in the corner of the drawer with her lingerie, was a small stack of papers tied together with a simple red ribbon. I stared at it for a moment, confused. Claire never kept random papers here, she was meticulous about her organization. My first thought was that it might be a collection of old letters, maybe notes I had written to her back when we were young and stupidly in love. But the way they were hidden, almost purposefully, made me hesitate. I reached in, my fingers trembling slightly, and pulled out the bundle. The ribbon slipped off easily, and I unfolded the top sheet. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a letter. It was a photograph. The image was blurry, taken from a distance, but it was unmistakable. Claire was sitting across from a man I didn't recognize at a small, dimly lit restaurant. Her smile was radiant, the kind she used to reserve just for me. My heart pounded in my chest, a sickening realization creeping up my spine. This wasn't just a casual dinner. I flipped to the next photo, my hands shaking now. It showed them at the bar, her hand resting lightly on his arm, their heads close together as if sharing a private joke. A wave of nausea hit me. I leaned against the dresser, feeling the room spin around me. What was I looking at? Who was this man? And why had Claire kept these photos hidden away like a dirty secret? My mind raced, desperately searching for explanations. Maybe it was just a friend. Maybe it was innocent. But as I continued through the stack, the photos grew more damning. They were outside a hotel now, the man's hand on the small of her back, guiding her inside. The last photo was the worst, Claire in his arms, their lips locked in a kiss that was anything but innocent. I dropped the photos as if they'd burned me, stumbling back, the air knocked out of my lungs. This couldn't be real. Claire, my wife of 15 years, the woman I'd built a life with, was having an affair. I felt a scream rising in my throat, but it got stuck there, replaced by a raw, guttural sound that barely escaped my lips. I bent down, grabbing the scattered photos, and that's when I noticed the small note tucked between them. I unfolded it, my vision blurring with a mix of tears and anger. The message was written in a hurried, scrawled hand: "You know what you need to do. Bring the money tonight, or these go public. No games." It was blackmail. The room closed in around me, the walls feeling like they were pressing in from all sides. I sank to the floor, the note clutched in my hand, trying to breathe, trying to make sense of what I'd found. Claire was being blackmailed. Not only had she betrayed me, but now she was entangled in something far more dangerous. My head spun with questions: who was this man? Why had she kept this from me? And what was she planning to do about the money? For what felt like hours, I sat there on the cold floor of our bedroom, the photos scattered around me like pieces of a shattered life. I thought about calling Claire, confronting her right then and there, demanding answers. But my hands were shaking too much to even pick up the phone. I needed time to think. I needed to figure out my next move before I did something I couldn't take back. As if on cue, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, seeing Dan's name flash on the screen. Dan, my best friend since college, the one person who knew me better than anyone. I answered without hesitation. "Hey, man," Dan's voice came through, cheerful as always. "You good? You sound out of breath." "I need you to come over," I said, my voice strained. It's about Claire." The line went silent for a moment. Then Dan's tone changed, becoming serious. "I'll be there in 10. I hung up and forced myself to get off the floor. I gathered the photos and the note, shoving them back into the drawer, not wanting them to be the first thing Dan saw when he walked in. My heart raced, every beat echoing in my ears like a countdown to some inevitable explosion. When Dan arrived, I barely managed to get the door open before he stepped inside, his eyes searching my face for clues. He looked at me like I was a ghost, pale and hollow-eyed. "What the hell happened?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. "Mark, you look like you've seen a murder." "Worse," I muttered, leading him to the bedroom. I pulled open the drawer, handing him the stack of photos. He went through them quickly, his face shifting from confusion to shock to anger. "Jesus Christ," he breathed. "Who is this guy?" "I don't know," I said, my voice cracking. "But that's not the worst part. Look at the note." Dan unfolded the paper, reading it in silence. When he looked up, his expression was a mixture of disbelief and fury. "Blackmail? This is insane. Why didn't she tell you?" "Because she's hiding it," I snapped, my voice rising. "She's been lying to me, Dan. I don't know how long this has been going on, but she's already taken the money. It's gone from our account." Dan's eyes widened. "Are you sure?" I pulled up the banking app on my phone, shoving it in his face. The empty balance spoke louder than any words could. Dan cursed under his breath, running a hand through his hair. "All right," he said finally, his voice steadying. "We can't let her do this alone. If she's meeting this guy tonight, we go there. We find out who he is and what the hell is going on. But you have to stay calm, Mark. You can't lose it." "Not yet." "I'm not sure I can," I admitted, the rage boiling just beneath the surface. "I've never felt like this before. I want to break something. I want to scream." Dan grabbed my shoulder, forcing me to look at him. "Focus," he said. "We'll get through this. But we need a plan." I took a deep breath, nodding slowly. He was right. I couldn't just storm in there blind. We needed a strategy, and I needed to keep my emotions in check. For now, at least. I was still reeling from the shock, trying to process the betrayal and the growing storm of emotions inside me, but there was no time for hesitation. We had a plan now, or at least the start of one. Dan and I left the house in a rush, barely speaking, the tension between us thick and electric. The drive to the meeting spot was silent, punctuated only by the sound of my fingers tapping against the steering wheel, each tap matching the rapid beat of my heart. Dan glanced over at me as we neared the location. "You sure about this?" he asked quietly. "We don't know who we're dealing with here. This guy could be dangerous." I tightened my grip on the wheel. "I don't care," I snapped. "I need to know who he is. I need to see his face." Dan nodded, not pushing me further. He knew better than to argue when I was like this. We pulled into a side street a few blocks away from the alley where Claire was supposed to meet him. It was a rundown part of town, far from the bright, familiar lights of our neighborhood. The street was deserted, only the occasional flicker of a streetlight breaking the darkness. We parked and settled in, peering through the windshield as we watched for any sign of Claire. I kept checking the time, every minute feeling like an eternity. Dan reached into the back seat, pulling out a pair of binoculars he'd stashed there. "Planning a safari?" I tried to joke, my voice coming out strained and brittle. "Old habit from my days in the force," Dan said with a shrug. He'd spent a few years as a cop before switching careers, but those instincts never left him. He handed me the binoculars. Here, use these. We can't get too close yet. I raised them to my eyes, scanning the area. The alley was narrow and shadowed, a perfect spot for a secret rendezvous. My stomach twisted as I spotted Claire's car parked near the entrance. She was already there, sitting in the driver's seat, her face illuminated by the dim glow of her phone screen. "What's she doing?" Dan asked, leaning in closer, trying to see what I was looking at. "She's just sitting there," I muttered. "Looks nervous." "Good. She should be." Dan glanced at me, a flash of concern crossing his face. "Mark, I get it. You're angry. But you have to stay sharp. We're here to get answers, not to lose control." I wanted to argue, to lash out, but I bit back the words. He was right. If I let my anger take over, we'd get nowhere. I forced myself to take a deep breath, steadying the storm inside me. We waited in silence, watching as another car approached, slowing down as it pulled into the alley. The headlights went off, and a man stepped out. He was tall, dressed in a dark jacket and jeans, his movements relaxed, almost casual. He looked around briefly before walking over to Claire's car. "That's him," I whispered, my voice low and filled with a venom I barely recognized as my own. "Stay put," Dan said, grabbing my arm as I made a move to open the door. "We need to see what happens first. If we rush in now, we could blow this." I clenched my jaw, my hand frozen on the door handle. Every fiber of my being was screaming to confront them, to demand answers right there and then. But I knew he was right. We needed to play this smart. Through the binoculars, I watched as Claire stepped out of the car, holding the same duffel bag I'd seen in the photos. She looked smaller than I remembered, vulnerable in a way that sent a pang of something like pity through me, despite everything. The man approached her, and they started talking, though I couldn't make out the words from this distance. But I didn't need to hear them to understand what was happening. The way he gestured towards the bag, the way she handed it over, this was the payoff. "They're making the exchange," Dan muttered. "Look at his face, Mark. Memorize it." I squinted through the lenses, trying to lock in every detail. His dark hair was cropped short, and he had a sharp jawline covered in a rough layer of stubble. He looked like the type who thrived on this kind of shady business, confident, smug. My blood boiled as I watched him laugh at something Claire said, reaching out to touch her arm. "That's enough," I growled, shoving the binoculars back at Dan and yanking the door open before he could stop me. "Mark, wait," he hissed, but I was already out, storming towards them. I heard Dan curse behind me, scrambling to follow. The man's head snapped up as I approached, his smile dropping the moment he saw me. Claire spun around, her face draining of color. "Mark!" she gasped, stepping back as if she'd seen a ghost. "What are you doing here?" I ignored her, my eyes locked on him. "Who the hell are you?" I demanded, my voice echoing off the alley walls. "And why are you blackmailing my wife?" The man smirked, taking a step back but not looking nearly as panicked as I'd hoped. "This must be the husband," he said with a chuckle, glancing at Claire. "You didn't tell me he'd be joining us." "Shut up," I snapped, stepping closer. I was inches from his face now, close enough to see the flicker of amusement in his eyes. "Give me the bag, and get the hell out of here." He laughed, a low, mocking sound that made my hands clench into fists. "Or what?" he taunted. "You're going to fight me over your cheating wife's mess? You really think you know what's going on here?" Before I could react, Dan stepped between us, shoving me back. "All right, that's enough," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "We don't want trouble, but we're not walking away without that bag." The man raised an eyebrow, glancing between the two of us. "Two against one, huh? This is cute. But you really don't know who you're messing with." "Maybe not," I said, pulling out my phone and snapping a photo of him. But now I've got your face. We can go to the police, make this a lot worse for you. His expression faltered for just a second, a flash of irritation breaking through his smug facade. He dropped the bag at my feet with a sneer. Fine. Take it. But this isn't over. You'll regret this. He turned on his heel, striding back to his car. Claire was crying now, covering her face with her hands. I wanted to comfort her, to pull her into my arms like I had so many times before, but I couldn't. Not now. Dan picked up the bag, slinging it over his shoulder. Let's get out of here, he said quietly. We've seen enough. I nodded numbly, following him back to the car. Claire didn't move, standing there in the middle of the alley, looking like she might collapse. Are you coming? I asked coldly, glancing back at her. She nodded, wiping her eyes. Yes, she whispered. But we need to talk. I got into the driver's seat, starting the engine without another word. There was nothing left to say. Not here, not now. The drive home was suffocatingly silent, the weight of what had just happened settling over us like a heavy fog. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning, and I had a feeling things were about to get a lot worse. The silence at home was deafening. We walked in through the front door, Dan, Claire, and me, like a trio of strangers who had been caught in some twisted play. I set the duffel bag down on the kitchen counter with a loud thud, the weight of the cash inside echoing through the room like a gunshot. Claire stood there, her eyes red and swollen from crying, but I felt nothing but cold, seething anger. Dan leaned against the counter, his expression unreadable. He'd always been the calm one, the logical one, but even he looked rattled. I could feel his eyes darting between us, trying to gauge who would break the silence first. It was Claire. Of course, it was. Mark, she began, her voice a broken whisper. Let me explain. Please. Explain. I snapped, rounding on her. The anger I'd been holding back exploded out of me like a flood. Explain what, Claire? The fact that you've been sneaking around behind my back. The fact that you're being blackmailed. Or that you stole money from our account without even telling me. She flinched, as if the words had physically struck her. I didn't steal it, she insisted, her voice trembling. I was trying to protect you. To protect us. Protect us. I echoed, laughing bitterly. How, Claire? By lying to my face for God knows how long. By letting some scumbag take our money while you met him in secret. You call that protection? Dan stepped forward, placing a hand on my shoulder. Mark, he said softly, maybe we should take a second to breathe. No. I shrugged him off, turning back to Claire. I want answers, and I want them now. Who is he, Claire? How did this start? Claire's eyes filled with fresh tears, and she sank into a chair at the kitchen table, burying her face in her hands. For a moment, I almost felt a pang of sympathy. Almost. But then I remembered the photos, the way she had kissed that man, the way she had looked at him with the kind of tenderness she hadn't shown me in years. The sympathy vanished. He's just someone I met through work, she began, her voice muffled by her hands. It started off innocent, I swear. We were just friends. But then, things got out of hand. I slammed my fist down on the table, making her jump. Out of hand. That's your excuse. You were meeting him at a hotel, Claire. You were having an affair. Claire looked up at me, her eyes wide with fear. I know. She cried, her voice cracking. I know what I did. And I'm so sorry, Mark. I never meant for it to go this far. Then why? I demanded, my voice barely above a whisper now, raw with the pain I'd been trying to suppress. Why did you do it? Was I not enough for you? Was our life not enough? She shook her head, fresh tears streaming down her cheeks. It wasn't about that, she said, her voice small and broken. It was never about you. It was me. I felt lost. Like I was drowning in this life we built together, and I couldn't find my way out. That's a load of crap, Claire, and you know it, I spat. You don't cheat on someone you love because you're feeling lost. You talk to them. You figure it out together. You don't lie and sneak around like a coward. Dan cleared his throat, stepping between us slightly, like he was trying to mediate a fight that had spiraled out of control. Look, he said, his voice firm but gentle. Yelling isn't going to solve this. Claire, we need the whole story. Not just pieces. Claire took a deep, shuddering breath, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. It started about 6 months ago, she admitted. I met him at a work conference. His name is Alex. We hit it off right away, talking about our jobs, our families. It felt good to have someone listen to me without any expectations. My chest tightened. So you decided to throw everything away for some stranger who listened to you? No, she shouted, slamming her hand on the table. It wasn't like that. I never planned any of this. It just happened. One night, we had too much to drink, and he kissed me. I pushed him away, but after that, everything changed. He started showing up at my office, sending me messages. At first, I ignored him, but then. Her voice trailed off, and she looked away, unable to meet my eyes. Then you gave in, I finished for her, my voice flat and lifeless. You decided he was worth more than us. Claire didn't respond, just nodded slowly, her shoulders sagging under the weight of her guilt. And the blackmail? Dan pressed, his voice quieter now. How did that come into play? Claire's face twisted in anguish. I ended it with Alex a few weeks ago, she whispered. I told him it was over, that I couldn't keep doing this. He seemed fine with it at first, but then, he showed up with the photos. He said he'd had a private investigator following us for months, that he'd collected evidence of our affair. He threatened to send them to you, to our friends, to everyone we know if I didn't pay him. I felt a wave of nausea roll through me. And instead of coming to me, you decided to handle it on your own, I said bitterly. You took our money and met him in secret, thinking that would make it all go away. Claire nodded miserably. I was scared, Mark. I was so scared of losing everything. I thought if I paid him off, it would be over. You thought wrong, Dan said, his voice hard. Blackmailers don't just go away when you give them what they want. They keep coming back. Claire buried her face in her hands again, her body racked with sobs. I turned away, unable to look at her anymore. I needed space, needed air. I'm going outside, I muttered, grabbing my jacket and heading for the door. Dan followed me out onto the porch, shutting the door softly behind us. The night air was cool, but it did nothing to calm the raging storm inside me. I leaned against the railing, staring out at the empty street, trying to get my breathing under control. Mark, Dan said quietly. You have to decide what you want to do next. This isn't just about the money. It's about your marriage, your life. I let out a bitter laugh. My marriage? What marriage, Dan? It's already over. It was over the moment she kissed him. He didn't argue, just stood there beside me, letting the silence stretch out between us. After a while, I spoke again, my voice barely a whisper. I don't know if I can forgive her. You don't have to decide that tonight, Dan said gently. But you do need to decide what you're going to do about Alex. He's not going to stop. You know that. I nodded slowly, the reality of it sinking in. You're right, I said. This isn't over. Not yet. I turned back towards the house, my jaw set with a new determination. We're going to make him pay, Dan. For everything. Dan gave me a grim nod. All right, he said. Then let's get to work. As we walked back inside, I felt something shift inside me, a cold, steely resolve. This wasn't about Claire anymore. It was about taking back control. About making sure Alex understood that he had messed with the wrong man. And I was ready to make him pay. The plan began to form the moment I walked back into the house. Claire sat slumped at the kitchen table, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I didn't feel pity anymore. I didn't feel much of anything for her in that moment, except maybe a hollow, distant kind of anger. I couldn't let it consume me now. I needed to stay sharp. Dan was right behind me, giving me a look that I knew all too well. It was the look he used to give when we played poker in college, the one that said he was ready for a fight. He crossed his arms, leaning against the counter as he glanced between Claire and me. "We need to figure out our next move," Dan said, breaking the silence. "This guy isn't going to just disappear because we took the money back tonight. He'll come after you, Mark. He'll come after Claire." Claire lifted her head, her eyes red and swollen, filled with a new kind of fear. "What do you mean?" "I gave him what he wanted. We have the money now. It's over, isn't it?" Dan let out a harsh laugh, shaking his head. "You don't get it, do you? Blackmailers never stop at just one payment. He'll bleed you dry if you let him. He knows he has leverage. He knows you're scared." I watched Claire's face crumble as the truth sank in. "What do we do then?" she asked, her voice small, almost childlike. I can't keep living like this, Mark. I'm sorry for everything I've done. But I can't fix it on my own." I stepped forward, leaning over the table so that I was eye level with her. "No, you can't," I said, my voice low and cold. "But you're going to help me fix it. You're going to help me set a trap for this bastard. We're going to make sure he doesn't come after us again." Her eyes widened. "A trap? How?" I pulled out my phone, scrolling through the messages I'd saved, the photos I'd taken of Alex tonight. "We have leverage now too," I said. "I have his face. I have evidence of his blackmail. If he thinks we're just going to roll over and let him take what he wants, he's got another thing coming." Dan nodded in agreement. "We can use this against him, Mark. We set up a fake meeting, make him think he's getting another payout. But instead of cash, we give him something else, proof that we're not afraid to go to the police." Claire looked between us, the fear in her eyes slowly giving way to a flicker of hope. "You really think that will work?" "It has to," I said simply. "It's our best shot." Dan pushed off the counter, stepping closer to the table. "All right then," he said. "Here's how we're going to do it." We spent the next hour strategizing, planning every detail down to the minute. We couldn't afford any mistakes. We agreed that I would message Alex from Claire's phone, arranging another meeting, making it sound like she was desperate to give him more money. It had to look real, convincing. I watched as she typed out the message, her hands shaking so badly that she could barely hold the phone. She looked up at me once she was done, tears brimming in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For all of it." I wanted to scream at her, to throw the phone across the room and tell her how badly she'd hurt me. But I couldn't afford that now. I forced myself to nod, taking the phone from her. "We'll deal with this later," I said. "Right now, we have a job to do." She nodded, wiping her eyes as she handed me the phone. I read the message she'd typed out. "I need to see you again. I have more money, but I need your promise this will be the last time. Please, I'm begging you." It was perfect. Desperate. Pathetic. Exactly the kind of message Alex would expect from a woman trapped in the web of her own mistakes. I hit send before she could change her mind. The next evening, we were ready. Dan and I arrived at the meeting spot an hour early, parking in a lot a few blocks away where we had a clear view of the alley. This time, we were prepared. Dan had brought a small voice recorder and a tiny camera that he'd rigged to the dashboard. We needed proof of everything, the blackmail, the threats, the exchange. If we were going to take Alex down, we needed an airtight case. You sure you want to do this? Dan asked, glancing over at me as he adjusted the camera. There's no going back after tonight. I'm sure, I said, my voice steely. This ends now. We waited in tense silence, the minutes ticking by like hours. Finally, Claire's car pulled up, parking just inside the alley. I could see her through the windshield, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. She was scared, and I couldn't blame her. I was scared too, but I couldn't let it show. Dan handed me the recorder. Keep this in your pocket, he said. Make sure it's on before you go in. I nodded, flipping the switch and feeling the weight of the tiny device like a stone in my hand. It was time. I stepped out of the car, giving Dan a brief nod. He gave me a tight smile, a look that said, "Be careful." I approached the alley slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. Claire stepped out of her car as I neared, her face pale and drawn. "Are you sure about this?" she whispered. "Yes," I said firmly. "Just stick to the plan." Before she could respond, headlights flashed at the end of the alley. A black sedan pulled up, and Alex stepped out, his silhouette tall and menacing against the dark street. He looked exactly the same as he had the night before, smug, confident, like a predator who knew he'd already won. "Claire," he said, his voice dripping with mock concern. "I didn't expect to see you again so soon. And you brought your husband. How sweet." I stepped forward, blocking Claire from his view. "Cut the crap, Alex," I said. "We know what this is about. We're not here to play games." His smile faltered for a split second, but he recovered quickly. "Oh. Then why are you here, Mark? Come to beg for mercy?" "No," I said, pulling out my phone. "I came to show you something." I pressed play on the voice recorder, letting the sound of his threats from the night before fill the alley. His eyes widened slightly, a flicker of real fear flashing across his face. "You recorded me," he snarled, stepping closer. "You think that's going to scare me?" I held up the phone, showing him the photos I'd taken, the messages I'd saved. "This is enough to ruin you, Alex," I said calmly. "We take this to the police, and you're done. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave us alone. You're going to disappear, and if I ever see you again, I will make sure these photos end up everywhere. Do you understand me?" His face twisted in rage, but I could see the panic in his eyes. He took a step back, clenching his fists. "You think you've won," he spat. "But this isn't over." "Yes, it is," I said, stepping closer, lowering my voice. "Get the hell out of my life, or I swear to God, I will destroy you." For a moment, I thought he might try to fight back, but then he turned on his heel, storming back to his car. He peeled out of the alley, tires screeching as he disappeared into the night. Claire let out a shuddering breath, sinking to her knees. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her it was okay, but I couldn't. I felt nothing but a cold, empty relief. "It's done," Dan said, coming up behind me. "We did it." I nodded slowly, staring at the spot where Alex's car had been. "Yeah," I muttered. "It's over." But as I looked down at Claire, trembling and broken on the ground, I knew that wasn't entirely true. This part might be over, but the real fight was just beginning. The silence at home after that night was unbearable. It wasn't the kind of silence that came from peace or quiet comfort, it was thick with tension, the unspoken words and unresolved emotions hanging in the air like a storm cloud. I couldn't look at Claire without seeing those photos, without hearing her whispered confessions in the kitchen, or feeling the betrayal twist in my gut like a knife. Dan stayed for a while after we got back, just to make sure things were calm, but even he seemed uncomfortable with the atmosphere. He gave me a firm pat on the back as he left, whispering, "Take it easy, Mark. You did what you had to do tonight. Now you just need to figure out what comes next." What comes next? Those words rang in my head like a bell, over and over again, as I lay in bed that night, staring up at the dark ceiling. Claire slept in the guest room, at my insistence. I couldn't bear to have her next to me, to feel her warmth, knowing she had given that same warmth to someone else. I thought I'd feel better after confronting Alex, after seeing him drive away with fear in his eyes. But instead, I felt empty. The anger that had fueled me for days was gone, leaving behind a hollow ache that I didn't know how to fill. By the time the sun began to rise, casting a pale light through the blinds, I still hadn't slept. I got out of bed, feeling like a man in a daze, and made my way to the kitchen. I needed coffee, something to clear my head, to help me think. But when I stepped into the room, I found Claire sitting there, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes puffy and red from crying. She looked up at me, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. Then she opened her mouth, her voice raw and pleading. "Mark, we need to talk." I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want another apology, another excuse. But I couldn't just walk away, either. I pulled out a chair and sat down across from her, the table feeling like a chasm between us. "All right," I said flatly. "Talk." She took a deep breath, her hands twisting together in her lap. "I know I've lost your trust," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "And I don't blame you. What I did was unforgivable. But I need you to know that I love you, Mark. I never stopped loving you. I was just lost." I scoffed, the sound bitter and sharp in the quiet room. "Lost?" I echoed. "That's your excuse. You were lost, so you decided to cheat on me and then hide it? Do you have any idea how pathetic that sounds?" Her face crumpled, fresh tears spilling over. "I know," she sobbed. "I know how it sounds. But it's the truth. I felt like I was drowning in our life, like I didn't know who I was anymore. And Alex, he made me feel seen. He made me feel like I mattered." I clenched my fists under the table, struggling to keep my voice steady. "And I didn't make you feel that way." "You did," she insisted, reaching out like she wanted to touch my hand, but she pulled back at the last second. "You did, Mark, but it changed. We changed. We got so caught up in our routines, in the kids, in work. I felt invisible. I know that's not an excuse. I know it doesn't justify what I did. But it's the only explanation I have." I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "I can't listen to this," I muttered, turning away. "Please, don't walk away," she begged, her voice breaking. "I'm not asking you to forgive me right now. I'm not even asking you to stay. I need you to know that I'm sorry. I made a terrible mistake, and I'll do anything to make it right." I turned back to her, feeling the weight of her words, the raw sincerity in her voice. For the first time since this nightmare began, I could see the fear in her eyes, the fear of losing everything, of losing me. "You want to make it right?" I asked quietly. "Then tell me the truth. Tell me everything. No more lies, no more half-truths. I want to know exactly how long this has been going on." She swallowed hard, nodding slowly. "It started 6 months ago," she said. "At first, it was just texting, flirting. I didn't think it would go any further. But then we met up, and it happened." "How many times?" I pressed, my voice cold. "4," she whispered, looking down at her hands. "4 times. And then I ended it. I told him I couldn't do it anymore. But that's when he started the blackmail. He said he'd ruin us if I didn't pay him." I laughed bitterly. "Ruin us? Claire, you ruined us the moment you decided to let him into your life. She didn't respond, just buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly. I watched her for a moment, the woman I had loved for so many years reduced to this broken, desperate figure. It hurt to look at her, to see what we had become. I walked over to the counter, pouring myself a cup of coffee, trying to ignore the way my hands were shaking. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," I said finally, my back still turned to her. "I know," she whispered. "I know I don't deserve it. But I want to try, Mark. I want to fight for us. If there's even a small chance that we can rebuild this, I'm willing to do whatever it takes." I turned around slowly, meeting her gaze. "And what if I'm not?" She flinched, as if I'd slapped her. Then I'll accept that," she said, her voice breaking. "I'll accept whatever you decide. But I had to tell you how I feel." I set the coffee cup down, feeling the weight of her words sink in. The truth was, I didn't know what I wanted anymore. Part of me wanted to walk away, to leave her behind and never look back. But another part of me, the part that remembered all the good times, all the love we'd shared, wanted to try. Wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way back to each other. "I need time," I said finally, my voice hoarse. "I can't decide this now. I need time to figure out what I want." She nodded, wiping her eyes. "Take all the time you need," she said softly. "I'll be here. I'll wait." I didn't respond, just turned and walked out of the kitchen, feeling like I was carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of my life. Claire and I lived in a fragile truce, like two wounded animals circling each other, unsure if we were going to fight or heal. I moved into the guest room, and we barely spoke, except when necessary. Dan checked in on me often, but there was only so much he could say. "It's your choice, Mark," he kept telling me. "You have to decide if this marriage is worth saving. And if it's not, then you need to walk away with your head held high." In the end, that's what I did. One night, after the kids had gone to bed, I found Claire sitting on the porch, staring out into the dark. I sat down beside her, the silence between us filled with 1,000 unspoken words. "I can't do this anymore," I said quietly. She turned to me, her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded slowly. "I understand." And that was it. We filed for divorce the next morning, the paperwork signed without a fight. It was the hardest decision I'd ever made, but it was the right one. I drove away from the courthouse, feeling a strange sense of relief. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was mine to walk. I wasn't looking back anymore. I was finally free.